Thank you for joining us today at the Project Management Institute's Sustainability Summit 2023. We hope you enjoyed that session and will stay tuned for our next one.
Hi everyone, and welcome today to this discussion. This is the next in the series of 6 systems for transformation, economy and finance. And today we've got a slightly different format from the normal 4 talks and discussion. We're going to have Jonathan Williams, also from the Sustainability Community of Action, joining us shortly. And then the 2 of us are going to be talking to Katie Flood from Ernst & Young, or EY as it is now. And we're just going to have quite a broad discussion around the economy and finance system and how that relates to projects. It's been really interesting preparing for this session. It almost seems like if it is something everyone's talking about, I just missed that memo. Or maybe it's something that we're not really talking about. So it will be interesting to talk about that a bit more and see if there are some things that we just need to raise some awareness on. So if Jonathan could join me on the stage, that would be brilliant. Hoping to click the right buttons in the right order. Here we go. Hey, Jonathan. So Jonathan and I are both members of the Sustainability Community of Action, which is a voluntary thing with PMI UK. Jonathan, do you want to give yourself a brief introduction?
Yeah, hello everybody. So my name is Jonathan Williams. I have a job title which is Project Futures Lead at the Environment Agency, and it's a great title, but it's looking forward at our projects. A lot of that space is data and digital, but what about things like benefits? What about things like future funding and financing around capital? So it's about having a broad knowledge of lots of things, but then bringing those home and relating them to projects. And so happy to be here and talk about this subject. Thanks, Esther.
Brilliant, Jonathan. And if Katie could please join us. We're trying this new sessions system with Hopin, but it looks like it's generally going well. And also people can send each other confetti, which is an interesting one. Jonathan, have some confetti. Katie, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today and coming to talk about projects and the economy and finance system. Do you want to just quickly introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do, and why are you here? And the answer is not just because we asked you to. Unfortunately, you're on mute again, Katie. We had this problem before.
How about now?
Yes, there we go.
Okay, so starting again, I am Katie Flood. I am a partner in EY, and I have grown up leading large transformation programs and projects in mainly the energy industry. I've come across government over the last number of years, looking at transport, education, and other areas where both we are trying to deliver large transformation programs, but consider how sustainability is rolled into those and engaged in those as well. I think this conversation is really interesting because it's not really a conversation we're even having here in Ireland, where I'm based. We're not really there on the public-private partnership piece around sustainability yet. We're very much focused on government funding for those large infrastructure programs or private funding, but the partnership piece isn't necessarily in as much play as we would like to see, I think. I'm definitely not a finance person. I'm going to say that from the outset. So there'll be times when even I'll look confused when you guys mention terms. But I do understand projects and programs. I understand how to get things done and how to, connect that benefits base to the transformation program and drive that through. I'm also the Director of Sustainability for the PMI here in Ireland, and we've only set that up over the last year. We've been having some webinars ourselves to kind of get that practice set up and get people engaged in understanding how project management and sustainability need to come together and what the role of project managers will be over the next number of years.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Yes, there is a big disclaimer on this event. None of us are economy or finance specialists. We all work in projects. And maybe at the end of this time, I will show you the sheer number of books I've been reading to try and understand this. The ones I found most useful are actually children's books. So I know, right? There are some really good children's books out there, and I don't diss them. I love the pictures. But I think that's almost part of the picture, is that, and this is something I have picked up in the reading and research I've been doing, is although economy and finance have a huge influence on all of our lives, there's sort of economy and finance literacy outside of the finance sector or economics degrees can actually be quite low. So yes, this is not financial experts talking about finance. This is a group of people who are in projects who are interested in the impacts of economy and finance, having a chat about it, and if anything, having a conversation more about what we don't know than what we do. So let's start. One of the previous talks that we had a while ago was about my fictional town called Saltwich, and we are again going to sometimes allude to Saltwich because there's certainly some projects none of us can really talk about openly. So what we do is we create a fictional scenario so we can kind of talk more about the principles of how these things work and also get away from some of the politics. This really isn't about whether one party's policies are better than another party. It's more about understanding, okay, what are some of the policies? What are some of the drivers? How do some of those systems work? Rather than a commentary on is anyone right? Probably the answer is no one person or one party is right. So in Saltwich, there was a railway back in the day. It got cut in the Beeching Cuts. It was very sad. It used to go from the capital to Pepperwich up to Saltwich. And one of the interesting things about railway development in the UK is how it's switched between public and private funding throughout the ages. So they nearly all started as private concerns. And we've temporarily lost Katie, who hopefully is coming back in shortly. That might be a connection issue. Jonathan, you're going to have to help me out here. Funding for railways in the UK largely started privately, to the extent that by World War I, there were apparently 120 different railway companies operating railways in the UK, often competing with each other directly, which is why some cities have multiple stations with no connections between them. Here's Katie back, brilliant. Then they were privatized in World War nationalized in World War I during the war periods. They were privatized again in the interwar period, nationalized in World War II. And then in 1948, I think, roughly around then, nationalized into British Rail, 1997, privatized, but then 2002, Rail Track, and I just about remember this, Rail Track becomes Network Rail, which is a publicly owned company. So one of the interesting things here is projects. There's a role for private finance, there's a role for public finance. Jonathan, what do you sort of understand about some of the differences between some of those things? What are some of the things we've been talking about?
I think some of the things that we've been talking about is looking at the whole system, and whether it's private or public, it's about combining to achieve the right outcomes. So it's having a broader look at the outcomes that any kind of project or scheme delivers. So for instance, a railway that goes between A and B, it will not just deliver transit from people between those places, but the structures and the assets that are built along that route, they may pass through woodland or over rivers, and in which case, could you just expand your scope a little bit and maybe improve the environment that they're built on? And I think it's just about, again, coming back to that point, whether it's public or private, what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and how can you almost stand up the benefits for the wider community that actually may then drive investment from more different partnerships that you may not have initially thought about.
So I think that's a really interesting point we could have a think about as Katie's connection problem hopefully resolves. We could have a think about what were the different purposes of some of the different partnerships in that development over time. So to take us back to the original railway development, you'd have groups of people coming together where the purpose was a commercial profit. And it was called what I believe is a laissez-faire approach. So the government did step in eventually, mostly to try and improve safety standards after a series of fatal accidents in the 1840s. So yeah, what do we think some of the purpose there was? Presumably it's return on investments for shareholders.
Yeah, again, I think you're assuming, aren't you? The need for a railway must be to transit something. That's what it does. But in terms of running that, then you get profitability questions, and I think the most successful or the most profitable routes were the ones that weren't cut by the Beecham cut. So, yeah,
no, that's true. Yeah.
So then you have to look at actually, well, what's the main driver? Actually, have we got a system that rewards the profit of an infrastructure? And actually, do we still need that? If that is a driver and that brings in income, then that might still be valid. But what are the other benefits it delivers, and can we actually gain more from looking at it from a wider lens? That's just my take on it.
Yeah, no, perfect. Katie, welcome back. I'm hoping you've also got sound.
Hopefully, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. I lost in there for a moment. So I think sustainability is required in Ireland for the internet.
So what we're talking about is not necessarily advantages and disadvantages of public versus private funding, but rather like we know there are lots of different projects needed. Some of them might look at private funding, some of them might look at public funding. What are some of the purposes or outcomes that could be associated with those? It's a bit of a broad question, but you can turn it into a useful answer.
I think the thing for me is, it's all the different agenda items. If we look at sustainability, it's such a broad topic. But if we look at infrastructure, transport, any element that we need to come together, energy, we've got to think about how do they actually come together as an ecosystem, and what's the best parts to build. And right now, we're sending everything off and trying to improve everything at once, but we're not really, like if we were doing a more agile program management, you probably try to look across the portfolio and see where can we create inflection points and improve those things, and how can we better use the funding available to get outcomes sooner. So I think some of the challenges that we don't really have at a government level, or at a public partnership level, an agency that's really looking across that ecosystem, whether it be in the UK, whether it be in Ireland, whether it be at a European level, whichever angle you want to take from that, but somebody who's really responsible for tying that together. And instead we keep going down the individual tracks, and eventually they do come together, but we don't get the opportunity to unlock the roadblocks in the value chain to really show the benefits of sustainability. And we're just trying to go at everything at once, and then people get accused of the kind of greenwashing and those kind of things, because what actually is happening is sustainability programs are far more about cost saving than they are about driving true sustainability. And that's kind of the outcome that happens, probably more so on the private side than public, right? But that's the outcome that happens. So trying to find a way to bring the parts together, so that then, I think like you were saying, Jonathan, how do we have then a benefits case across that rather than the individual pieces? Because we talk about sustainability broadly, so why isn't there a broad plan instead of the minutiae plans?
I think that's really interesting, and what just struck me in talking about that, so Jonathan and I generally are both public sector, public funding side of things. Do we think it's the case that investment cases for public funding, do they look quite different for the investment cases for private funding? My gut instinct is I think they probably do look quite different, but I mostly only see the public side.
I think there's commercial realities, to both sides, but probably a bit more pressure to justify sustainability projects in a private capacity, and also ensuring that return on investment is there almost immediately. Whereas with public funding, there's the ability to have a more long-term view, I think. I mean, if you look at, I don't know how many CEOs in the FTSE, stay in their job more than 4 years, typically that's a 4 to 5 year tenure. So the viewpoint is much more narrow on a time frame basis, rather than just, how do we get funding for doing the right thing?
I did see something the other day that the average lifespan's the wrong phrase, but the average length of career in the finance sector is only 25 years. Mm-hmm. So I'd already be halfway through my career, whereas in my world, I'm like a quarter of the way through my career. So yeah, it's that really interesting thing, you know, the refresh of knowledge, you know, often is only 25 years. You've got just over a decade is kind of the horizon that people will remember having dealt with. Whereas in, you know, infrastructure, a lot of the time we're talking about the 60s.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a view as well that, you know, in that last 5 of those 25 years, you see those seasoned financiers in their roles, you know, looking for legacy projects to try and make an impact. And I think those are the people that you see coming into sustainability programs and trying to drive them more frequently. Whereas people early in their career are far more focused on a commercial outcome because that's how they're going to be judged and measured. So trying to bring the balance of the two together and have long-term sustainable programs to derive long-term sustainable benefits is what's needed.
So, Jonathan, we've talked a little bit about funding partnerships. So if we can recognise that there's probably different investment criteria between public projects and private funded projects, you know, so as Katie was talking about, you know, the difference in return on investment. So for roads projects, the return on investment is about 60 years that we assess. Whereas, of course, you know, as we say, private sector, it might be, you know, if you haven't turned a profit in 2 or 3 years, there's a problem. I think you've had some, if I got this right, some exposure to blended finance projects, or, you know, seen that sort of thinking on the cards. How do you think, if you've got 2 different groups trying to invest in projects together but with really different investment criteria, any observations?
That's a tough one. Any observations?
It is. You can redirect. As we said, this is not an experts discussion. This is a muddle it through because we need to start talking about this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a capital perspective, particularly one that's driven by public spending, the government kind of spend, we are obliged to go out and seek partnership funding from all the beneficiaries. And this is what I was saying earlier about, you know, if we take our remit of managing flood risk, and I'll go back to the Environment Agency here on that topic. We look at who benefits in terms of who are better protected, or whose flood risk is better managed by an asset that we either refurbish or build from scratch. And they're the beneficiaries that we could say, you know, you're directly impacted by the scheme, that drives partnership funding, and unlocks, you know, potential for us to partner with these people to get the overall part of the scheme's money. But if we take, you know, a theoretical future state, you know, what's it look like if we go by catchments, you know, water catchments, and we look more broadly at, you know, every beneficiary or system that relies on that water course. You know, it could be increased demand, not just taking water resources for drinking purposes, but then the water recycling centres, you know, putting sewage or wastewater back into those rivers. How do we then unlock the potential that we're going to improve those environments? What about the ecotourism that could come from rewilding our rivers, the increased fish populations that might bring back our salmon or our eels and drive different industries or leisure activities from that? And I think it's having a broader look at some of these projects and linking them to the entire system. When we discuss this, it's there's a built environment on top of a natural environment, and I think in the past we've always said, well, how do we manage that natural environment? How do we sort of keep the two almost separate? How does one become beneficial for the other? And I think maybe if we look at it more broadly as an interface, you know, how can we mimic the natural or natural environments or the systems that are in play already, but by doing that in a built way that delivers our services and the systems that we need for our population to grow and thrive as it will do. And I think that's something that we can do. We've proven that we can do it in the past through the Industrial Revolution, but let's do it actually in a way that mimics nature. And there are some brilliant success stories, but it needs that more catchment-wide perspective. Rolling it forward into how do we get more private funding into that? Well, and this is my opinion, what about marketplaces, environmental marketplaces that might say, we have outcomes to deliver. can anybody else, deliver those for us and receive a fund or a payment mechanism for it? Again, it comes back to monetizing it. I know it does, and it's a currency, but that's something that we can exchange. And there are some great use cases of these environmental markets, sort of emerging and being that space for people to say, I've done this towards sustainable drainage, or I've done this towards environmental outcomes. Not being the direct driver for that organization to exist. So I think that there's just some thoughts.
No, that's great.
Yes,
I'm
that's
gonna
your
go, Katie.
world that you've created, which is Salt Witch. It does allow us to kind of immerse ourselves in an idea of what an environment like that could look like. In the UK, are there cities that are kind of eco cities or eco towns that have been set up? I know in Ireland, down in the southwest, around Kerry, we have a small city. We're trying to make an ecotourism site with all of the hydrogen buses and really kind of push that element of it to kind of create an environment where people can come and see how this is real, which is kind of similar to the Good Friday Agreement, effectively, that was put in place between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, because in that agreement and the relationships that are there with the US, they created a visa system. So Irish people could go over to the US and see what a multicultural environment looked like, rightly or wrongly, and how you could apply that in what was a very closed environment here in Ireland 25 years ago. It's expanded massively since. So that method of creating the environment, creating the Salt Witch in a small ecosystem can really show that this can be done. We just need to scale it up. We just need the investment. We need those partners in that marketplace. Are there any examples that you guys know of in the UK that are doing that?
I'm not aware of any. But again, this is one of the things that wouldn't have crossed my desk, if that makes sense. Jonathan, are you aware of any specifically?
Not specific in terms of a built city. There are things. I think there's schemes up in Cumbria that are looking at more catchment for an environment. As I keep going back to sort of river catchments, there are broader projects looking at the whole system there, but not specifically from a city built from scratch or from driving the sustainable agenda. I don't know of one that exists. But is that because if we go back to Salt Witch and Pepper Witch, they've grown over a number of years, hundreds of years in places,
10,000 years,
1,000 years, and have they grown almost organically in that time? And are we in a world where actually we need to be retrofitting with the new science and new methodologies, the new technologies that we are becoming almost reliant on? Maybe we're having to retrofit the old for the new. I did read a story together. This is a bit of an anecdote. It was about listed buildings and how some I can't remember the organization or the building itself, but they are purchasing land to build lots of solar panels to then power their buildings. So actually, is there a policy challenge here that says if we've got lots and lots of listed buildings, should we be almost incrementally improving or increasing our footprint to deal with the energy, or should we actually be relaxing planning to maybe have solar system or more renewable energies in our listed stock? That's just a thing for me. This was it Earth Day was a week or so ago where we've exhausted
overshoot
day
comes earlier every year.
If we all buy more and more land to satisfy our energy needs, then actually are we going to get to more like 2 or 3 times the Earth that we need to power our systems that exist today? So it's all that imbalance, and it's this whole systems approach. How do we sort of release or relax one part to satisfy the needs of where our existing footprints are?
So let's unpick some of that with, again, a little bit of economic theory from my children's book. And also to pick up a question from Stuart in the chat. Do add questions if you are interested in throwing something into the mix. You can use the chat for that. So yes, one of the questions was sort of how has the economy of the fictional Salt Witch evolved over time? And you start with basic trading between small communities, and the idea that if one person's better at hunting and another person's better at weaving, if one person hunts more than they need to hunt, then they can trade the surplus. At some point, money is invented as a way of transferring that value, partly because if you had to hunt lots of rabbits in order to afford your cloth, but that takes you, 3 weeks, some of those rabbits are going to be pretty rotten by the end of that. Not such a good trade. So currency and money is invented partly to help that transfer of value. All sorts of interesting financial evolution happens, and I think there's even a specific branch of study called something like evolutionary economics, which kind of suggests that in some ways, yes, that the economy is kind of an ecosystem of its own. Interestingly, one of the things it reflects the most is the vagaries of human behavior, and not the way that nature finds a balance. It's much more about whether humans are confident or afraid, and whether they're therefore trading or selling, essentially. What we then get is this idea of the invisible hand of the market that I believe comes from a dude called Adam Smith in either 1600s or something like that. And to give an example, lots of people like to talk about Freddos from my part of the world, which is a small chocolate frog that when I was a child cost 5 pence, and now costs much more than 5 pence, and it's a travesty, and we all complain about it. But essentially, I'm 36, so say it's 30 years of Freddo usage. Inflation over time and the growth of the world economy over time means the price of a Freddo has gone up, in the same way that cinema tickets have gone up and bags of crisps have gone up. And there's sort of that thing that we can accept that prices do generally rise as economic output generally increases. And there's this idea that the price of the chocolate bar is supposed to be set at the optimum point by the market. If the traders charge too much for the chocolate bar, I'll stop buying it. There's this invisible signal, this whole line of communication that ripples through the chocolate making industry that says Esther is no longer interested in buying that chocolate bar. And without me having to have a conversation with anyone else in the system, especially as I can now use my, the self-scan at my supermarket of choice, I can indicate my interest in chocolate bars. The level of chocolate bars produced could go up and down. And so the kind of theory here is that the price of the chocolate bar is that perfect piece of information that means that the markets will turn out exactly the right number of chocolate bars for exactly the right number for exactly the right price. That assumes that the market accounts for everything. And so one of the things we've already hinted about, and it's in the chat, is the fact that pricing does not always account for what are called externalities. So that the chocolate bar does not probably include the price of the amount of carbon taken to grow and produce the chocolate. It will take account of it in some countries where the electricity emissions used for the factory are traded emissions, but won't in others. It will include some transport costs, not others. It almost certainly won't include if deforestation has occurred in order to source some of those products and the biodiversity loss and the climate loss associated with that. So what we've started to hint at here is this idea of how could we add more of that into the price? And that's some of the carbon credits discussion, some of the biodiversity units credits discussion that is starting to come through in the UK. So one of the questions is, could we as project professionals in considering our pricing consider more things? End of small economics theory lesson. What do you guys think about pricing, externalities, and options there?
Well, I think that piece on, carbon credits, it's not really tangible for people yet, I don't think. So obviously on a macroeconomic, standpoint, we can set up the trading platforms, we can report on that through ESG, we can look to trade, and we can get all that in place. But I think people, when you get to, your practical example of a Freddo bar that people are buying, it doesn't feel natural, it doesn't feel real. Well, that's the gap, that's the void that we're trying to find ways to address, and find ways to bring that to life for people. And I think theoretically that all makes sense, but do people have trust and faith in that system? I don't think so, because you can't yet rely on the ESG reporting data and the consistency of that. We've seen, Elon Musk coming out and giving out about the Tesla example. They're doing poorly on their ESG reporting, yet they're making electric cars. I mean, this just doesn't really add up in the ecosystem. So I think the challenge is getting those additional cost factors ingrained into it without it just inflating the cost of the product. And a bit like the cost saving, people feel like that using sustainability to justify a higher price without a different product. Whereas if you bring out a new product that I can say is vegan, that I can say is sustainably sourced, that I can say is sustainably made, and all of the parts of that value chain are sustainable, I can justify a price on that. But you can't tell me that the Freddo's now 10p more because suddenly you're factoring in the carbon credits. I think that's the challenge with the brownfield, being a project, an ERP system delivery person, a brownfield versus greenfield site. There's two different challenges within that for me. I don't know what you think, Jonathan.
Yeah, I think it's just picking up on your point there about the driver, and I think it goes right back to what Esther was saying, that as a consumer, Esther's literally saying that's it. I'm no longer going to buy a Freddo. What we have seen, and I think there was a great speech by James Bevan a couple of years ago, and he said actually we are making progress on this. That the consumers or the people, the community that we serve, are actually demanding to know that the organisations they're either consuming from or buying from are delivering more environmental outcomes. So actually, what the businesses are now doing are responding to that. So they're actually recognizing not that it's the financial thing to do, it's not the thing that makes sense financially, but actually in order to almost keep their customer base and the consumers loyal to them, they are actually having to change to be more transparent and open about what they're doing for environmental or social gain. So that's something that we have spotted, or it's been spotted already, and that hasn't been driven by policy. Yes, that policy is kind of going and the structure's there to try and improve it, but I think the economy, finance, the businesses are already shifting, spotting what the community and people want. So not so much specifically on what Katie was saying, but certainly a consumer choice. I think we see that a lot in the energy markets. There's a lot of voting to get the sort of green or renewable energy. That's just one example of it. How do we do that for probably all the other commodities out there?
So in terms of some of the role of projects in some of this, through the research that I've done, I think one of the things that might become important is some of the assurance. So for example, a pension fund or a corporate investor or someone with money could come and say, okay, there's now a market for carbon units or biodiversity units. I am looking to do projects that will deliver that so that I can get the money for doing that as a return. And at the moment, one of the challenges, I haven't looked at it in enough detail to give you any specific examples, but I know sort of like, what's the word, colloquially, that sometimes there is greenwashing of existing carbon credits or forestry credits, and essentially, someone's claiming they've planted a new forest, but it's amazing how many times they've planted new forests in that one space. Deeply dubious. So I think there is something around assurance. If there does become a market for delivering these sorts of projects, let's be really clear that the returns are being generated and the right returns are being generated. I have quite a lot of discussions in the biodiversity space, and so one of the questions that always comes up, well, no, it doesn't always come up, I think I always bring it up to be more precise, is is it really the case that you can swap woodland for wetland? I mean, if you ask a fish has quite a profound view, should they be sentient, on the difference between a wetland and a woodland, but a biodiversity unit calculation might not. So some of it is, what could our role be in some of the assessments around some of these things, and some of the assurance around some of these things, to make sure that it's not just the latest commodity that goes a bit nuts and ends up a bit like cryptocurrency, but rather is really delivering the right outcomes. Any thoughts?
Isn't that the big risk? That it could end up like cryptocurrency because people don't have the trust in it. So how do you create that trust? And I think it's improving through the ESG reporting frameworks that are in place. You can look at things like in Ireland, there's innovation tax credit. So if you do a large transformation program, but you're creating something distinctly new, you can then look at getting innovation credits for that. So is there a sustainability credit that's available to allow and drive programs to look at sustainability in everything that they do? And I think that's some of the challenge, making sustainability ubiquitous in projects and programs, just like digital now is. Consumers demand it. So, businesses, both public and private, are trying to catch up and provide the service that people expect. Sustainability hasn't quite got to that level of maturity. There's a bit of confusion in some cases when it comes to consumer products. People are choosing, or if they're coming to energy products, like you said, Jonathan, people are choosing to choose the green energy service and pay that little bit more potentially for, or right now, they still have to compete. There's only, 6 key utilities in the UK that are providing the services, and then a couple of those smaller ones. So they still have to compete in that market. So realistically, they have to get to an economic delivery model for that. But I think if we can find a way to bring sustainability into the board of every program, and that it's a measure that somebody's looking at, we look at risks and issues, we look at benefits, we look at the milestones and timeline of a program. But I work on very few programs, no matter what they're related to, that actually have any kind of sustainability measure in them. So it's not embedded in there. Digital often is. Digital is often the principle of a program. It's digital first, is one of the key principles of a lot of the programs. Or low code, no code to allow us to get to digital might be a key principle of a program that's helping you make decisions to ensure that we're being as digital as possible in this program. But that kind of structure isn't existing, as a decision that's in the fabric of project program yet around sustainability. Some of it because it's not so tangible. People can't see why this big ERP program, an Oracle and SAP program, why, how can I make this sustainable? So it's hard to make that leap. Others, that might be large capital programs that are doing infrastructure that will allow for more sustainability or more sustainable transport or something like that. That's easier for people to connect to. But we still don't measure sustainability in that program. We want the outcome to be that we have hydrogen buses on the road, but we're not measuring sustainability and our decisioning based around sustainability during the course of the program. So I think getting things to come into the programs to allow us to measure that and get trust around that measurement and get consistency. And I think that's possibly, even from the PMI perspective, that's the type of thing that we need to embed into our methodologies so people can feel confident that they're doing the right things and they're not kind of making it up themselves. The frameworks need to represent that and show that in there so it's easy to do that measurement, I think.
I think that's really useful, and the sort of idea of are we going to have a PMI or Europe-wide or whatever it is? Are we going to have a sort of a self-governing standard of how we do the assurance of these things, what we report on, that we just say, look, as project managers, this is what we think is acceptable. People can use or not use the information to make their decisions. That is up to them. But we're going to start producing the information to say, this is what we think is your actual outputs assured. We think you should include this in decision making. This is what is happening as a result of the impacts of your decisions. So, for example, in the supply chain, if we were tracking our materials a bit more, this is where the steel came from. This is the result of the steel coming from there, and just making some of that more transparent, maybe.
Can I come back on something that Katie mentioned there? It was around your risks and issues. And we touched on this before, Esther, around when we do our research about benefits, the outcomes that they deliver, there's lots of policy. We've got some I've mentioned already about valuing not just natural capital, but then heritage value. So, historic sites, monuments, those kind of things. So the policy's there, the guidance is there, everything to justify a scheme seems to be in place. but then actually through the life of that project, something happens. Now, I don't know what that is. You mentioned risks and issues, but there is the opportunities part as well, which I think gets underplayed a little bit. So we have all of this kind of structure and sort of guidance to justify why a scheme should be run. Then when it becomes almost hands on ground, spades in ground, that kind of work, we then seem to go over to our risk register, and then we underplay, or we play out that mitigation piece to the point that maybe we're missing opportunities to improve the environment. The biggest thing I can say is, making it real, is around badger sets or water voles or protected habitat. We tend to stick a fence around it and an exclusion zone. We don't go near it. Okay, that's what we tend to do if we're managing that risk for a project. But why don't we actually extend that scope and look at that and say, actually, that already exists on our site, but what's the condition of it? Is it suboptimum? Is it not quite where it could be? Actually, with a bit of thinking, could we create a prime habitat? Could we improve the population? Could we maybe integrate something that maybe is a benefit to a different wildlife or creature or species? And I think it's that thinking, what happens through a project lifecycle where we justify what could be achieved, and then we end up with something that, I don't know, is manageable, it's low risk, it's the most confident that we're going to deliver it. And I don't know what happens. I don't know, Katie, if you've got an opinion on that.
John, I love that concept of opportunities that you call out, because we don't look at that. We're just got this fixed scope we're trying to deliver. There's so many complexities to what you're trying to do. You're just trying to get it over the line. Once you get into project mode, you're trying to get pace, push that thing forward. I think that's what Agile effectively is intending that we can do. Look at where have we gotten to, what's our strategy now, and what's the best road to getting there, not assuming that if we just keep driving down this road, we're going to get to the outcome we were trying to achieve. And I think when it comes to these large infrastructure programs, because of the funding mechanism, we kind of almost by default fall into that traditional waterfall model of delivery. And we're not looking at, how you can order that, but also the funding mechanisms don't allow for that, whether that's in a semi-state organization, the financial, the CFO's office does not allow for more agile funding to allow for that decision making, because they're looking for you to deliver exactly what you said on the tin. They want exactly this out of it. And your example, biodiversity example there reminded me of something, it's quite different than what I do, is, large transformation from a more IT people and an organizational change. But there's a place in Donegal in Ireland, and it's actually a Netflix show about this. It's really interesting. And the intent was to return indigenous animals to Ireland, like the Irish wolfhound that had been roaming, the hills of Ireland and has long since gone, and creating an environment that was their natural true habitat, and getting the funding for that. And actually, like, just in relation to this, it's not the purpose of that show. The purpose of the show is actually probably to publicize and get people to go to it now. And if you look at it, though, you can see the challenges in the funding for creating that environment and the learning that they had to go through to say, actually, now that I've gone and understood those animals more and looked at the environment that I need to create for those to sustain here and be safe here, I need these other 10 things to be put in place, but I can't get the funding because they're in a very traditional funding model from the banks here in Ireland, and they can't get that release. And you see, and obviously COVID hit during the middle of that as well. So what you see is, like, I think a 4 or 5 year process, which could have taken 1 year, and somebody basically almost failing because they can't get this set up. So I think there's a lot of that, in projects, looking at the opportunity to pivot, to get the same outcome, if not a better outcome. And I think that's where, when projects and programs are clear on the outcome you're trying to achieve and not just trying to deliver widgets, that you can create that framework, but the funding model doesn't meet at the moment. And I don't know how to fix that in smaller organizations or in semi-states. We've worked with them in, to release smaller pockets of funding to allow for that. They can do it to a certain level, but not at a large infrastructure level at all. And I think that's a big challenge for the future.
So I want to pick up on this discussion about essentially where does the money come from? And also to sort of reinforce why we are having this conversation about finance. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals team in the United Nations produced a report a little while ago that they estimate that $4.2 trillion a year is needed in funding in order to reach the UN Sustainable Development Goals for people and for the planet, which is roughly 4 times the amount the UK government spends in a year in total. Which would make you think, in terms of public spending, like it's just literally not going to happen. If one of the biggest economies in the world, British economy, if that government is only in total spending a quarter of that a year, how are you supposed to make any progress? But then in saying that, so the GDP of the UK, we're not going to have a discussion today about the advantages and disadvantages of GDP. Let's just go with it for now. Is around $3 trillion, and global economic output is around $85 trillion. So essentially, if we just allocated about 5% of global economic output towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, like the money is there. And this is some of what I came to understand in some of the research that I've done. So it's something like global pension assets are $50 trillion, insurance assets are $40 trillion. There is so much money in the system. And so what we need to understand is how to get hold of it. So there's been a variety of models through history. There's a subscription model where you collect payments and then pay money out of that. There's ones where you get a fund together, invest that fund, and pay money off the interest that you get. There's bonds. So, one of the biggest ages of global expansion, which happens to be associated with the British Empire as it happens, is driven by the formation of the Bank of England, that one that helps us control inflation, in order to finance the Royal Navy. Like, that is what it was built for. The idea was that then British investors, instead of just giving tax to the government, they could also invest their savings with the government for a return, or invest their capital for a return. It also turns out things like banks kind of just create credit, and it's often 10 times or 20 times more than they have in their deposits, which to me is just mental. I do not understand it. Can you imagine being given a project budget of £500 million and saying, like, yeah, I'm going to leverage that to a factor of 10 and I'm actually going to spend like £5 billion? Okay, everyone be like, what? So there is something here. I don't know what it is, but it feels a bit like the way we run a lot of projects is we still go to mum and dad to ask for our pocket money every week, when there's been this huge financial revolution. It turns out that in my lifetime, global GDP, global output has doubled. And in my grandparents' lifetime, it's gone up by a factor of 5. So this is all actually relatively new and relatively recent. How do we get hold of some of that money for the projects we need to do? And how do we make some of the projects more attractive for these investors who have all this money? I don't know the answers to that, but does anyone have any thoughts?
I'll go ahead, Jonathan, go first. It's just fine. I'll jump in. I think from my perspective, this group and probably everybody on the call is very favourable to this is where we should invest the money. And if all that money is available, let's get it across now. But we have to be realistic to the environment around us. And if you look to US, and not to bring politics into it, but I mean, that polarized environment will show you there's a very black and white view at an almost 50-50 level of people who believe that this is where we should be investing money, and that our legacy is to protect the environment for our children in the future. And there's 50% who think, no, actually, that's all, so maybe climate denier is too strong a word, but that it's not the crisis that people claim it is. And that's the problem. So in each of those seats of government that need to release that funding, and each of those private organizations that have that money to release, or those pension funds are going to invest, you're at best looking at 50% of that pot. Now, I know you're saying we only need 5%, but it's that split that makes this so difficult. And it's creating, I think for me, and I know we talked about it last week, Esther, I think The challenge for me is the conversation is very much around scarcity, and economics is about scarcity. I get that, but I think people, hearts and minds, that's playing into fear. It's pushing people backwards, and all of those headlines really push people to almost become insular and self-focused as a result of the fear that's pushed upon them. Whereas if we create a world that looks at regeneration, and that creates a positivity around sustainability, I think we'd start to get to a very different conversation, and that we would see momentum growing because people want to focus on that. And I think that's the gap for me, that I hope in my lifetime that I will help to support and drive, at least here in Ireland, to try and create that excitement around regeneration. Because I think for us as an island nation in Ireland, we can be that, on the edge of Europe example that could really show that we are trying to regenerate here in Ireland, trying to use all of those older buildings and transform them into sustainable, usable buildings, try to reduce the housing crisis through doing that, and try to bring all of those sustainable energy opportunities to be a reality, along with the infrastructure programs that we're putting in place. So I think regeneration and changing the narrative is what's going to allow us to access some of that funding. But that's very much my personal view.
No, that's cool.
I think, I think part through there, what Katie was saying is there's two things, isn't there? Is your professional action, what you do as a project delivery professional, but then going back to one of our previous talks and what Stuart thought was so neatly saying about individual action. So the agency that we have within ourselves. Now that could be everything you do from your life. I've looked at my house. It's a very old house. It's leaky in terms of drafty. It's heating is a bit of an issue for me. No insulation. I've done what I can. But even if you look at biodiversity in my garden, putting up a bird box and targeting species that are on the decline. This year I had a great tit nest in, and I don't see birds in my garden, because I'm quite in an urban environment. So all of this is just examples, and I know it's not the greatest thing, but the individual action that you can do by recognise what's around you and just providing help for that, it could be a big thing. So I'd liken this whole group, community of action. What can we do in a project sense? How can we link policy structures and guidance to individual action or professional action on each individual project or at home? Even if we just start talking about it, when we can start doing things around it. Climate Fresk is a brilliant thing you'll see coming out of this group. Also on the chat, I've noticed a few things around carbon offsetting. We've spoken about greenwashing, I think, has been a term that's been used in this call. There are some great organizations that are challenging those big conceptions. One that I personally like to follow is a company called South Pole, and just some of the debates they're having about challenging the overall global positioning on offsetting and metrics around that. It's brilliant. So start engaging in those conversations, start learning about the truth within it, and then applying it at an individual level, and then rolling it up into project level. I think that's how we can start to move forward.
I think we can also be more engaged in. It's kind of like there could be more democracy around money than we realize. So one of the other things I came to learn in researching this is it's something like pension and insurance pots, so the institutional investors, I think they're called, are now a bigger proportion of owners of things like the stock markets and global assets than corporate. And the place that pensions and insurance companies and those institutional investors get money from, essentially a lot of the time, is from us. So, if I think about my paycheck, which, I try not to be honest, but anyway, if I think about my paycheck, there's an amount of money that goes straight out in tax and national insurance. For me, there's an amount that goes straight out for my student loan. There's an amount that goes out as my pension contribution. There's an amount that goes out in my mortgage. There's an amount that goes out for my house insurance and my car insurance. I am only used to voting around the amount that goes out in terms of pay as I earn tax and council tax. Those are the things I vote for. But I contribute to quite a lot of people with quite a lot of pots of money, and we all do, in fact. And potentially we actually own a lot of that money. Like some of the times it is our money already. It's not just the case that it's big multinational corporations calling all the shots. That's some of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. So if we think about how much we invest in terms of time and effort in political discussions about spending £1 trillion a year in comparison to the $85 trillion a year, some of which we contribute to not just through our tax deductions, what could that look like? Individually, what could that look like if all of us came together and said, actually, we want the money to be spent like this? That I just think it could just be really different, and it's quite interesting having learned more about some of this stuff. We've got 5 minutes to go, so I'm going to let Jonathan any quick closing remarks, and then Katie closing remarks. I've got a couple of notices, and in the chat for those people looking to claim PDU codes, but also for everyone, please can you do the post-event survey? Put the survey link to get the code. Jonathan, quick closing remarks.
No, nothing further for me. Just thanks for the time. Thanks for the discussion.
Cool. Katie, anything you'd like to just add?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, our role, what we can do here is really consider how we can bring sustainability into our projects and programs, how we can support in building out frameworks that will deliver projects in a sustainable way. And I don't mean in a project that can run for a sustainable amount of time, instead bringing those elements in and making sure that we're looking at all aspects. And I think the last piece is around how do we connect that funding from the large business case sitting either with the infrastructure programs and with large government approvals required, or that's a small project you're doing within an organization, but how can we connect the funding to allow for some more flexibility to drive better sustainable outcomes that are more connected across a number of programs that are in the ecosystem. And I don't think we've landed on the answers to that today, but I think if we champion the conversations, then we can help within the PMI to help drive that out into everything we do day to day as project managers.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. If anyone is interested in coming on the economic journey that I am currently on, I am reading Neil Ferguson's A Set of Money.
I definitely want to see the kids' access to it. That's more my level.
I'm going to bring the children's books out, don't you worry. A Little History of Economics by Neil Kishtani. But then, yes, my personal favourites, the Usborne book of Economics for Beginners and the Usborne book of Money for Beginners, which are much more my level, I'm not going to lie. And I think, just in closing myself, I think as a profession, I think we're going to need to be involved in some of this assurance that we've been talking about. I think we're going to need to be involved in some of this discussion about the right projects to invest in and why. And that's even just in the market as we currently experience it. I think we're going to need to be more transparent or just smarter about reporting the real impacts our projects are having and our supply chains are happening, whether we're asked to report the information or not. I'm not saying we need to put it all over the front pages of the tabloids, but I think we should be prepared to be accountable for providing that information to decision makers. And then I think there probably is something around needing to work out how do we unlock that 4.1 trillion a year that the world needs. We're problem solvers, people. Like, we pull off all sorts of crazy stuff that most people would hide under their beds if they were asked to achieve. Let's just add a bit of finance to that, no biggie. And on that note, thank you so much, Katie. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to have you. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining. It's been a great conversation. If you're watching the recording, I hope you've enjoyed that. If you're joining us live, thank you so much.
Please get ready because the next session is about to start.